In the first half of the 19th century, there was a single murder that, having ensnared the English countryside in a web of scandal, permeated throughout society and popular culture for decades after its conclusion. Having all the elements of a story written as a gothic thriller, the so-named Red Barn murder sparked a year-long mystery, culminating in a revelation that exposed a history of darkness hidden beneath the façade of respectability that shocked the nation to its core. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories. I'm Ben, as always. This is Series 8, Episode 10. And today's episode, this is one that I've been meaning to do for a long time. It's had a lot of people ask me to do it, requested. And you might have noticed I've been doing a few more requests this season. I've sort of consciously gone back and been trying to do episodes that have been frequently requested. And this was always one of them. But the funny thing is about this episode is I actually thought that I'd done it. I had all the books. I keep folders on my computer of all my research and stuff and all the materials that I've been using for every episode. And I actually had a folder on my computer with all like birth certificates and death certificates and all sorts in. I must have at one point started this episode and then discarded it halfway through for whatever reason, which made obviously the research for this episode a little bit easier than normal because I had a lot of it right there. So that was good. Here we are anyway. We got there in the end. This is William Corder and the Red Barn Murder. 9 miles north of Colchester, in the English county of Suffolk, 80 miles northeast of London, Polstead is a small, picturesque rural village with a population of 900. A single medieval church with roots dating all the way back to the 7th century sits to the south of a pair of murky brown ponds, making up a trio of the most prominent features of the village. A half-dozen narrow tree and hedge-lined roads split off to the north, separating the small hamlets that house all of the cottages of the village from the surrounding field. In the centre of the main thoroughfare lies a single pub, the Cock Inn, which has served as a social and community centre for the entire parish since the 16th century. It is, for all intents and purposes, a typical English village, with little to separate it or differentiate it from many hundreds of other little hamlets dotted throughout the countryside, completely unremarkable to those outsiders passing through. Almost unchanged for at least 200 years, way back in 1827, it matched the same description to a remarkable degree. Even the population has barely changed. Elsewhere in England, in the 19th century, industrialisation was powering a major facelift, transforming small urban towns into urban epicentres and economic juggernauts. London had recently surpassed Beijing as the largest city in the world, shortly after the first public railway was opened in 1825. The urban affluence contrasted harshly with the rural population, however, who by and large remained primarily agricultural, both economically and culturally, and whilst it was not a life of poverty or destitution, incomes had been declining for some time, widening the gap between city and country dwellers. In Polstead, the industrial machine that was the British Empire seemed as distant and alien as ever, as farmers worked the surrounding fields, propping up an economy that had barely changed for centuries. Famous for its cherries, the Polstead Black, it held a 2-day cherry festival annually in order to celebrate the small hamlet's single claim to fame. In the summer of 1827, the glory of mass communication was about to carry Polstead to the outside world in a big way, however, and see the village descended upon by tourists from all corners of the country, all travelling to the little green hamlet in order to see for themselves a feature which, until now, had never been seen as anything especially interesting. A rustic old barn, standing on a hill, its red paint long since bleached, flaked and stripped away on the wind, perched on land worked by a local family known as the Corders. The recently ascended patriarch, William, had made quite a fuss amongst the general public after he'd been arrested for murdering his fiancée before disappearing to London to live it up as a gentleman of leisure. It was all quite enough to stir excitement in a population learning to feast on the gory details of murder and scandal en masse, and William Corder, Polstead, and its fine reputation for cherries were all about to find themselves projected across the nation in a way that they never would have thought possible. William Corder was born on the 21st of June 1804, the ninth child of John and Mary Corder, a pair of tenant farmers who cared for a 300-acre slab of land rented from Thomas Cook, the lord of the nearby white brick manor of Polstead Hall. Although 3 of their children had died in infancy and another had failed to make it to adulthood, the family was still large, with John and Mary Corder living together with William and his 3 brothers, John, James and Thomas, and 2 sisters in a large wood-framed farmhouse that sat just down the hill from the farm's large thatched stable and outhouses, its striking red paint giving it its local name of the Red Barn. The Corders were well known in Polstead, and John and Mary had gained a shining reputation, living comfortably as successful farmers. William attended school in Polstead until he turned 14, when he was sent off to boarding school 5 miles up the road in the nearby town of Harley. Academically, William got on fine, though he gained a less than stellar reputation, known amongst his schoolmates as Foxy Corder on account of his tendency to lie. Following his graduation, at the age of 16, he returned home to Polstead to help his father as a farm labourer, though it was a situation that was doomed to failure thanks to William's lack of interest and continuing attachment to his less than honest traits. On one occasion, he took out a loan of £10 in his father's name, without his father having any knowledge, and on another, he sold the farm's pigs to his neighbour, again with his father having no knowledge of the deal, forcing him to repurchase them and putting him significantly out of pocket. Eventually, having enough of his son's transgressions, he packed William off to London with the hopes of finding him a ship that would take him to work at sea. But after no captains were willing to employ him on account of his poor eyesight, he was forced to return to farm work, much against his father's wishes. William was not an unusually sickly child, especially in comparison to 2 of his brothers, who had always suffered with a fairly weak constitution, but he did walk with something of a stoop, and it was certainly true that his eyesight was poor, and he struggled with far-sightedness from a relatively young age. For the next 4 years, he continued to work on the farm, and caused his family grief, becoming known as something of a livewire, with a taste for partying and womanizing, becoming the father to at least 1 illegitimate child in that time. Surprisingly, despite all of his other wayward dealings, he rarely, if ever, got drunk, which perhaps gave his parents some relief. At the age of 20, William found religion and became deeply interested in the Bible, but it was apparently not a particularly long-lasting infatuation, since a little while later he had packed up farm work and took off for London in the company of a prostitute that he'd taken a fancy to. Though his life in London is not well documented, it's safe to assume that the relationship didn't last, since he returned to Polstead alone a year later in 1825, following his father's death. The farm passed to Thomas, with all siblings receiving a £350 even share of their father's estate. However, that soon grew to a fairly lucrative deal for William, whose 2 sickly brothers both passed away from consumption in the same year, shortly after their father, and then, after Thomas died in 1827, when he fell through the ice on one of the village ponds and drowned, William took over, becoming the family's patriarch. By this point, William had started dating Maria Martin, a local girl who was 3 years his senior. Born on the 23rd of July, 1801, Maria was the second of 5 children, born to Thomas Martin, the village mole catcher, and his wife Grace. The family lived in a cosy 5-room cottage surrounded by a garden full of rose bushes and cherry trees. At a young age, Maria was sent to work as a nursery maid with a local clergyman. However, she returned home at the age of 10 to help her father after her mother died in 1811. Maria's father remarried within a year to a woman from a neighbouring village 21 years younger than himself named Anne-Marie, and together they went on to have another 3 children. Fortunately, due to her upbringing as a servant girl in a house of the clergy, Maria had been taught to read and write to a good standard and was considered both well-mannered and of fine form and figure. At the age of 18, she met William Corder's older brother, Thomas, and the pair began a secret relationship, most likely due to Maria's lower class status, and by the age of 20, she was pregnant with Thomas's child. The baby, a daughter named Matilda, was born in 1822, but she died just 3 months later. If the birth and death of their child had been traumatic for Maria, things were not helped by Thomas's swift movement to distance himself from the relationship following the pregnancy, though Maria soon seemed to move on as she started dating a local, well-to-do gentleman named Peter Matthews. Matthews was a well-respected, well-off city dweller and as such, the relationship between himself and Maria was once more carried out with a degree of secrecy, and once more it hit a snag when Maria fell pregnant again. The class differences between the two made it practically impossible for any sort of marriage, and so instead Matthews paid Maria £5 a quarter for maintenance, which was at least a relatively generous amount for the time, well above what would have been enforced by the parish. Maria would already have known William Corder from the days that she had been in a relationship with his older brother Thomas, though by the time they started their relationship in 1826, he was well on his way to being a far better catch than he may have been previously, thanks to a number of his family members all passing away in short succession. As usual, life continued to be fraught with peaks and troughs for Maria, who once again found herself pregnant in the summer of 1826. Hoping to keep the pregnancy a secret, William rented a room in nearby Sudbury, where Maria was hidden away until April of 1827, after the baby was born. Unfortunately, it was a sickly infant, and in the early 19th century, that usually spoke for a bleak future, which was realised only a few weeks later when it died in infancy. Intending to continue the secrecy around the birth, William and Maria buried it quietly in one of the fields on William's farm. Despite all their clandestine efforts, however, rumours spread around the small village, and before long there were whispers that William himself had had a hand in the baby's death, though the accusations only ever remained as hushed gossip. Following the pregnancy, William and Maria finally made plans to marry, and William told Maria and her family that he had arranged to collect a marriage licence in Ipswich, and the two began making plans to travel to the town on the 14th of May, gathering that Sunday to leave Polstead early the next morning. At the last minute, however, William inexplicably delayed the trip until Wednesday. When Wednesday came, he once more delayed again, until the following day, which he of course delayed again, this time using the poor health of his brother as an excuse as to why he was unable to leave. Things stepped into a hurry the next morning, however, on Friday the 18th of May, when William arrived at Maria's family home early in the morning, telling her that she had to get herself ready to leave immediately, saying with some panic in his voice that he'd found out that the parish constable, John Ballum, had obtained a warrant for Maria's arrest due to her propensity to birth bastard children. A plan was hastily rushed together, whereby Maria was to dress up in men's clothing and leave the house together with William, with the two heading up to the Red Barn on the Corder farm, where William had previously stashed a selection of Maria's clothing. Once she had got changed, they would leave and head out of town, quietly bound for Ipswich, where they could carry out their marriage. Maria, dressed in disguise, waved goodbye to her mother and headed to the Red Barn with William, though she would never make it to Ipswich. Over the following months, William returned to work on the farm whilst the will of his father was settled. On the occasions that he saw Maria's mother, he told her that he and Maria had travelled to Ipswich together, where he had left Maria staying with a sister of an old school friend of his named Mrs. Rowland. When Maria's mother asked him if Maria was in need of any clothing, he assured her that Mrs. Rowland was taking care of all of her needs, and that she was well provisioned for on account of William cashing a cheque for £20 that she could live from. Besides, before long, he assured her, the two would be able to obtain their marriage licence, when they would then take it to London to be married and live happily ever after. Maria's mother wasn't entirely convinced by this story, especially since she had heard from her 10-year-old son, George, that he had seen William up by the Red Barn carrying a pickaxe on the day that he told her that he had travelled to Ipswich. Later, she also saw William using Maria's umbrella whilst he was attending his brother's funeral, but when she asked him about it, he lied and said it belonged to someone else. Still, William seemed relaxed enough about the whole thing, so she was happy to await Maria's letters, which William said she would write to her just as soon as the injury to her hand had healed, which was currently making writing difficult. Meanwhile, William's tricky past was beginning to catch up with him. Several months previous, he had taken one of Maria's maintenance cheques of £5 from Peter Matthews and cashed it for himself. The whole affair had caused some confusion initially, with William denying any knowledge of the money, but as evidence and witnesses began to stack up against him, he was eventually only let off the hook after Maria lied in order to cover for him. Now, however, Matthews was back in Polstead, and unconvinced of Maria's story, he now wanted an apology from William, though, fortunately for William, he had promised to forgive him if only he would admit to the theft in the first place. This William did, writing Matthews a letter dated on the 1st of August, promising, with the greatest possible humility, to throw myself at your feet and implore your pardon. He then went on to explain that Maria was currently in a village named Herringby, following a trip to Norfolk with a distant female relation, who was presumably the same Mrs. Rowland from the story that he had told Maria's mother, and that the two of them were planning to be wed within the next 4 weeks. Towards the end of the summer, following the settling of his father's will and his inheritance, he visited a doctor who told him that he was in dire need of a holiday following a summer of hard work managing both his deceased father's and brother's farms. A trip to the south coast to catch some sea air was apparently in order, and so William enlisted the aid of William Pryke, a bailiff who worked on the Calder farm, to manage the affairs in his absence, and then took off. Not for the south coast, however, instead taking a room at the Bull Inn in Leadenhall Street, London. By 1827, Leadenhall Street was a bustling market street, probably most famous for the presence of East India House, the headquarters for the East India Company. The rattling horse and carts carrying goods from the busy shop fronts that line the street was a far cry from the idyllic beaches of the south coast, where William was meant to be recuperating. Whether or not he did spend any time on the coast is something of a mystery, as the letters he wrote whilst in London were anything but clear. To Maria's mother, he explained that he was in London conducting business before returning to Maria on the Isle of Wight, where he said that they had taken up lodgings in Newport. Shortly after, he wrote a second letter to George Gardiner, a friend of his in Polstead, explaining that he had been touring the south coast, all the way from Exeter to Portsmouth, having the time of his life with a young, charming, innocent and lovely female who he said was from Yorkshire. Somewhat awkwardly, William had bumped into Peter Matthews, who just so happened to live local to Leadenhall Street, who told William that Maria's parents had been expressing some concern for their daughter, since they still hadn't heard anything from her since she'd left for Ipswich. William assured him that Maria was in the Isle of Wight and doing well, and assured him again that the two of them would be married just as soon as he had settled his affairs. Whether or not he had any affairs that needed settling, it seems that at least neither of the stories told to Maria's mother and his friend George Gardiner appeared to be true, as a month later he inserted an advertisement in a series of London papers, including a large column smack bang in the centre of the front page of the Sunday Times, posing as a bachelor seeking a wife. Matrimony, a private gentleman aged 24, entirely independent, whose disposition is not to be exceeded, has lately lost chief of his family by hand of Providence, which has occasioned discord amongst the remainder under circumstances most disagreeable to relate. To any female of respectability, who would study for domestic comforts and be willing to confide her future happiness to one in every way qualified to render the marriage state desirable, as the advertiser is in affluence, the lady must have the power of some property, which may remain in her own possession. Many very happy marriages have taken place through means similar to this now resorted to, and it is hoped no one will answer this through impertinent curiosity. But should this meet the eye of any agreeable lady who feels desirous of meeting with a sociable, tender, kind and sympathising companion, they will find this advertisement worthy of notice. Honour and secrecy may be relied on. Despite what William had written, it was still a fairly unusual thing to be advertising for a wife in the London papers. Nevertheless, the advert proved popular, furnishing William with over 90 replies, though he only ever read the first 40 or so before he met with a woman named Mary Moore, a spinster 8 years his senior, who had seen his advertisement and replied, leading to a shatteringly fast wedding just a week after they first met on the 27th of November at the Church of St Andrew in Holborn. The ceremony had been so quick, in fact, that William's scheduled adverts were still printing just 2 days before the two were wed. Mary Moore was a relatively cultured lady, having worked as a governess in France before returning to England to run a boarding school for girls in Gray's Inn, London, next door to her brother's goldsmith shop. Having been hoodwinked on a number of levels by William, she had accepted William's hand in marriage under the pretence that he was a gentleman with an annual income of £400 from farming properties that were inherited from his father, which was, I suppose, at least half true. Soon after the wedding, Mary sold her home, and the two purchased another school named Grove House down the road in Brentford, alongside the Thames. William and Mary were equal partners in the purchase, and before long the two were settling into their new life together as schoolmasters. Things were not entirely smooth running, however, with Mary becoming more and more aware that William seemed to be carrying some issues, manifesting in restless nights where he would toss and turn, frequently moaning and talking in his sleep. William was also struggling to uphold the façade of his suggested wealth and had resorted to some pretty extreme measures to get his hands on cash, including an attempt to defraud a bank of £93 by cashing a fraudulent cheque, passing himself off as a farmer who had just sold his cattle. Meanwhile, back in Polstead, Mary's mother, now deeply concerned for her daughter's well-being, had started having some truly bizarre dreams, and she was now fairly sure that she needed to act upon them. A few days after William had been cashing his forged cheque in London, Mary's father, Thomas, was being informed by his wife that she'd been having dreams since Christmas that Maria had been murdered by William and buried in the Red Barn. At first she'd kept quiet, not wanting to appear superstitious, but the nagging suspicion had eventually proved too much, and she had told her husband about both her dreams and the strange details surrounding William. On Saturday, the 19th of April, Thomas grabbed his trusty molespike, collected William Pryke, the bailiff currently managing the Corder farm, and together they made their way up to the Red Barn to see if his wife's dreams had any stock to them. In the least, the trip might put their minds at ease. When they entered the gloomy old building, Pryke began scraping through the straw scattered on the ground with a rake, whilst Thomas set about stabbing his molespike into the ground, here and there, probing for anything that may have been buried beneath the surface. As the straw scattered about, a section in the middle of the bay, covered in loose rocks, appeared to Thomas to have shown signs of being recently disturbed, and stabbing his spike into the dirt, he pulled it back to find it covered in something black that smelt disagreeable. Digging through the loose ground, they quickly uncovered the body of a woman, laying on its side, with a handkerchief tied tightly around her neck. Pryke suggested fetching more help, and Thomas retired outside to await his return around 30 minutes later with another local man named Mr. Botle, the coroner and the local surgeon. The men re-entered the barn and continued to expose the body, digging back the mud until they had uncovered a shallow grave around 1.5 feet deep. Placing the body on an old door, they carried it out to the nearby barn door in order to examine it in more light, when Thomas noted that the mouth looked distinctly like Maria's. Under the body, they found 2 combs, a shawl and a pair of earrings. The inquest took place the next day, on the morning on Sunday the 20th of April, at the Cock Inn pub in Polstead. After the surgeon, John Lawton, took the jury up to the barn to see the body, Thomas and Anne Martin gave their testimonies, identifying the clothing, earrings and combs found with the body as Maria's. They then went on to tell the story of how William claimed to be alighting with Maria in order to marry in Ipswich, and of how Maria had recently given birth to William's child, of how it had died, and of how they had buried it in a field on the farm. They then went on to lay out William's recent excuses as to why Maria had been unable to write home due to her supposedly injured hand. Thomas seemed to decide it was best to keep his wife's prophetic dreams quiet, and instead said that he was searching the barn looking for something. Anne, on the other hand, decided to be honest, telling the room, "Before Christmas, I dreamt the deceased was buried in the bay of the barn, and I had the same dream afterwards, and told my husband of it sometime afterwards." Following the information that William was known to have carried a loaded pistol, the coroner ruled it necessary to bring William in, charging Constable Ayres with the task of tracking him down and adjourning the inquest until it had done so. Ayres spoke to George Gardiner, who gave him William's last known address in London, and then the policeman set off for the capital. Once he arrived, his first port of call was to the Whitechapel police station on Lambeth Street, where he requested the aid of Officer James Lee, and together they went in search of William Corder. On Monday, the two decided that their best bet was to check out William's Gray's Inn address, but on their arrival they were told by the servant that he had left some months previous for a new boarding school in Brentford. As something of a loss, they made their way to Brentford and looked to ask around blindly, hoping that someone may be able to recognise their descriptions of William and give them a lead. As luck would have it, the landlord of the Red Lion Inn pub happened to have a daughter attending a local boarding school, and was reasonably sure that he'd heard a man there being called Mr. Corder. A plan was formed to head to the school the next morning, with James Lee accompanying the landlord and his daughter, hoping to catch sight of William, whilst Constable Ayres would stay back fearing William might recognise him and make a run for it. With the plan set, the group set off just before 10 a.m. and made their way to the school. It was just after 10 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday the 22nd of April, when William was cooking breakfast in the parlour of his Brentford boarding school, boiling eggs in his dressing gown, as he was called out into the hallway to meet one of his students and their father, who he was told was accompanied by a man wishing to place his daughter at their school. When he stepped into the hall, the landlord greeted him, calling him Mr. Corder, and when he replied, Lee swept in, arresting him on the suspicion of murder. Fortunately for Officer Lee, despite the charge, William was not an especially dangerous prisoner, and the officers allowed him to finish his breakfast before carrying him off back to the station. As expected, William denied all knowledge of Maria's murder. In fact, he went as far as to deny knowing anyone named Maria Martin at all. His room at the school was searched and a pair of pistols, along with a short sword, was removed and entered into evidence. Whilst Ayres escorted William back to Polstead, the story hit the newspapers in a fairly big way, with the Morning Chronicle dedicating an entire full-length column to the dramatic story. The following Friday, the 25th of April, Coroner Wayman resumed the inquest to a much more enthused room, which now, thanks to the newspaper coverage, was considerably more full, with a full contingent of journalists. Elsewhere in the pub, a party added further commotion to the somewhat out-of-place proceedings. The day didn't start well for William, after Constable John Ballum gave testimony denying that he'd ever held a warrant for Maria's arrest, contrary to the story that William had fed the Martins on the morning of Maria's disappearance. Things hardly improved after young George Martin stepped up next to describe how he had seen William leaving the barn carrying a pickaxe over his shoulder later that day, when he was supposed to be in Ipswich. Last up, the surgeon who examined the body, Dr. John Lawton, gave his medical evidence, and whilst his examination and testimony was relatively detailed, his conclusions were only able to ascertain that cause of death had been violence. The body had not been disturbed when I saw it, but merely the earth removed from the upper part. The body was removed from the ground and placed on a barn door in the light. It was much decomposed from having lain a long time in the ground. I examined it as carefully as I possibly could, and I assisted in taking off the clothes. The first thing I took hold of was a piece of sack. I pulled it off the face, and I pulled other parts of the sack from various parts of the body. I found the body lying on the right side, with the head forced down upon the right shoulder. There was an appearance upon the face which convinced me that there had been blood there, and I found blood upon the clothes and upon the green striped handkerchief, which was tied very tight around the neck. The handkerchief had apparently been pulled tight around the neck, and there was a space between the outer fold of it and the tight part sufficient for a hand to have been inserted. In the neck, just below the fold of the handkerchief, there was the appearance of a wound inflicted by a sharp instrument, but the part was in such a state of decomposition that I can only state it had had that appearance. There also appeared to have been injury inflicted in the orbit of the right eye. It appeared as if something had been thrust in, and had occasioned a fracture of the internal bones of the orbit and nose. There did not appear to be any gown over the body. There was a flannel petticoat or shift, stays, stockings, and high shoes. The several things found on the body were delivered to John Ballum, the constable. I examined the chest and abdomen and found no injury anywhere within the body. I found 2 small portions of bone within the throat. Supposing an injury to have been received in the bones of the nose and orbit, these pieces might have got into the throat through the mouth, or they might have fallen down through decay. The left hand was separated from the wrist and was lying on the body. This might have arisen from decay. The other handkerchief and the shift had blood upon them, considerable appearances of blood. I am of the opinion the deceased's death proceeded from violence. Finally, after the grim details from the surgeon, William was brought in to hear the evidence read out, and then the jury was sent out to make their decision. 30 minutes later, they returned to deliver a verdict of willful murder against William Corder, setting him up for a full-scale trial. William was then escorted to Bury Jail to await trial at the summer assizes. Following the inquest, the newspapers gave a damning report for William, who they more or less considered guilty from the outset. The police, however, were somewhat less confident. The prosecution knew that the evidence against William sounded considerable, but they were also aware that it was entirely circumstantial and that they had absolutely nothing concrete tying him to the murder. They were also facing the difficult truth that the medical evidence did not even really give a conclusive cause of death. Hoping to put their doubts to bed, the body of Maria was quietly exhumed by lamplight at 4 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of May, a month after she had been buried following the suspension of the inquest. Primarily, the prosecution hoped to confirm whether or not she had been stabbed and whether or not the head wound had been an exit wound from a pistol shot or a stab wound made from a heavy, sharp instrument. A stab wound was thought to have been found in the body's right side that seemed to correspond with the bloodstain found on the clothing that appeared to have penetrated the heart. As such, 2 ribs and the heart were removed for further analysis, along with the head, before the rest of the body was reburied. Once the body parts were in better light, etch marks were found on the ribs, along with a cut through the right ventricle of the heart, all of which corresponded with a stab wound. The head wound was confirmed to have been a wound created by a pistol ball fired from slightly behind the victim that had ricocheted through the jaw, teeth and nose, and finally exited through the right eye. It also appeared that further stab wounds had been made in the throat and face after the shot. The prosecution could at least be more confident on the cause of death. However, they were still lacking evidence. For the most part, it appeared as if they would be going into trial with a grand sum of a stack of hearsay, some medical evidence, and the fact that William had owned a pair of pistols and a sword. Meanwhile, the defence was busy building a case to suggest that Maria had shot herself with a pistol that she had stolen from William following an argument. Neither side were particularly confident with the cases that they were building, but with the public opinion leaning heavily against William, it would have been the defence who would have been more nervous awaiting the trial. 3 months after the inquest, the trial of William Corder finally opened on the morning of the 7th of August 1828 to much excitement. In the months leading up to the event, the newspapers had made the case the talk of the town, and the trial had quickly become the hottest ticket that summer. Despite torrential rain showers, the crowd outside the courtroom in Bury St Edmunds, when the doors opened, was so large that it took over an hour and a half for Corder to be escorted to the entrance and for the court to reach a degree of order. During all the chaos, people were crushed. Wigs, hats, robes and pocketbooks were all stolen, as barristers, magistrates, police and public all clamoured to get a view of the accused. Finally, at 9:40 a.m, William Corder, in a dark dress coat, waistcoat and trousers, was placed at the bar in order to hear his indictments read to the room. A grand total of 10 counts were read against him, and since the prosecution had still not confidently been able to conclude how Maria had been murdered, they covered a wide assortment of options, figuring that at least one of them should stick. Once the lengthy accusations were made, Corder pled not guilty on each count and then took his seat as the jury was sworn in, themselves having had to crowd-surf their way into the courtroom over the heads of the swarm of people outside. A scale model of the Red Barn, alongside plans for the surrounding fields, was placed on view on a table in the centre of the court, and Judge Lord Chief Baron William Alexander settled down for the main event to get underway. The prosecution opened the proceedings by walking through the facts of the case at great length, and then described the factors leading to the identification of the body of Maria Martin. The rest of the day was given to stacking up a significant amount of circumstantial evidence being laid out to the courtroom, as Maria's mother, Anne, described William and Maria's relationship, the birth and death of their baby, of how William had stolen £5 of Maria's maintenance money, of how William frequently carried loaded pistols with him, and of how she had seen him with the pistols on the day of Maria's disappearance. From Constable Ballum, the court was told of how he had never had a warrant for Maria's arrest, and several of the Corders' farm labourers told that during the harvest, William had instructed them to pile up the hay in the barn on the spot precisely where Maria was buried. The second day was largely given to the medical evidence, which had begun the previous evening and had mainly focused on the surgeon John Lawton's conclusions as to the cause of death, chiefly that he didn't believe the bullet wound would have been enough to have killed Maria alone. The highlight of the day was when John Lawton took Maria's skull along with William's sword and attempted to recreate the theory that Maria had been stabbed in the face, showing the trajectory of the blade through the right eye, at the same time pointing out the direction the bullet had travelled through the bones. The other injuries, the stab wound in Maria's neck and the tightly knotted handkerchief around her neck, were explained in detail. It then turned to William to open his defence. Almost immediately, he called upon the jury to discard any prejudice that they may have been fed via the press, which he called a powerful engine that had worked to picture him as the most depraved of human monsters. Knowing that the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial, he admitted that it looked damning against him, but that nevertheless it was all entirely explainable. He first explained how the death of their baby had come about, of how it had died naturally and not by violent means, as had been falsely given out by the newspapers. He explained that he had always kept a pair of loaded pistols in his bedroom, and of how he had taught Maria how to use them. He then said that Maria had been depressed for a long time, and that despite being very much attached to her, of how Maria had pushed him to marry her, despite William's family not agreeing to their relationship on account of her class and her previous illegitimate child with Matthews. He said that he could not remember saying that there was a warrant for Maria's arrest, but that he had suggested that she dress as a man in order to conceal their elopement from his own family. When they reached the barn, he said that Maria had argued with him concerning his family and of how she would never be accepted by his mother. William then went on to tell the court that after she suggested he didn't care for her as much as Matthews had, he'd walked off and left her alone in the barn. As he made his way to the gate, he heard the pistol firing in the barn behind him. He stood for a few moments in what he described as complete stupefaction before he ran back to find Maria lying on the ground. Realising that he would look very guilty on account of the shot being fired from his own pistols, he began to panic. Rather than running for help, he took the poor decision, aided by the fear of being found guilty for murder, to bury the body in the barn instead. He then pointed out, rather specifically, that he never stabbed Maria, openly suggesting that the surgeons had only concluded that the wounds were from stabbing due to a sword being found in his room when he was arrested, theorising that any wounds on the body were instead made when the body was dug up from the barn. As for motive, this section of his defence seemingly stood on much stronger ground. In essence, he questioned why he would have taken Maria to the barn to murder her when everyone in Maria's family watched them leave together and knew precisely where they were going. He had no need of breaking off the relationship in such a violent manner, stating that if he wanted to separate from Maria, he could have done so at any time by more conventional means. Furthermore, he used the fact that he stayed in Polstead for several months after Maria's death, as well as his placing an advert in the Times newspaper selling his wife's boarding school under his own name, as evidence that he was not fleeing from a murder, nor trying to lay low or disappear. Following this statement, a small parade of witnesses were called to attest to his good character, before the judge summarised the case for the jury, making sure he voiced his scepticism concerning William's statement that Maria had shot herself. We all know that it is a circumstance which too often happens that poor girls, when they have been disappointed in their expectations, have laid rash hands upon themselves, generally strangulation or poison. In this case, if you give credit to the evidence of the surgeons, there were first the wounds in the eye and the cheek inflicted by a ball, and then the wounds inflicted with a sharp instrument that was broader on one side than the other, on the heart and ribs, and on the vertebrae on the neck behind the skull. It is a very extraordinary thing that instead of hanging herself from a tree, as poor infatuated and disappointed girls generally do, Maria Martin should have used 2 different means to kill herself. The jury then excused themselves from the room, returning 35 minutes later to deliver their verdict to the judge, finding William Corder guilty of the murder of Maria Martin. William Corder, it now becomes my most painful duty to announce to you the near approach of your mortal career. You have been accused of murder, which is the highest offence that can be found in the annals of crime. You denied your guilt and put yourself upon the deliverance to your country. A jury, that country has decided against you, and that decision is most just. William was escorted from the courtroom in tears, where he was taken back to his jail cell to await his impending execution. At 11:30 p.m. on the night of August 10th, with his execution the following morning looming over him, William Corder dictated his confession to the governor of the prison, John Orridge. I acknowledge being guilty of the death of poor Maria Martin by shooting her with a pistol. The particulars are as follows. When we left her father's house, we began quarrelling about the burial of the child. she apprehending that the place wherein it was deposited would be found out. The quarrel continued for about 3/4 of an hour, upon this and other subjects. A scuffle ensued, and during the scuffle, and at that time I think she had hold of me, I took the pistol from the side pocket of my velveteen jacket and fired. She fell and died in an instant. I never saw even a struggle. I was overwhelmed with agitation and dismay. The body fell near the front doors, near the door of the barn. A vast quantity of blood issued from the wound and ran onto the floor and through the crevices. Having determined to bury the body in the barn, about 2 hours after she was dead, I went and borrowed the spade of Mrs. Stowe, but before I went there, I dragged the body from the barn into the chaff house and locked up the barn. I returned again to the barn and began to dig the hole, but the spade being a bad one, and the earth firm and hard, I was obliged to go home for a pickaxe and a better spade, with which I dug the hole, and then buried the body. I think I dragged the body by the handkerchief that was tied around her neck. It was dark when I finished covering up the body. I went the next day and washed the blood off from the barn floor. I declare to Almighty God I had no sharp instrument about me, and that no other wound but the one made by the pistol was inflicted by me. I have been guilty of great idleness, and at times led a dissolute life, but I hope through the mercy of God be forgiven. At 5 a.m. the next morning, crowds slowly began to arrive at the site of the scaffold in a paddock just outside the prison's walls. 6.5 hours later, as William was being prepared to make his final walk, the throng had grown to what was estimated as between 8,000 and 9,000 strong. The executioner, John Foxton, who had been brought in specially from Newgate, fastened the black cloth hood over William's head and then cut the rope to the platform, midway through the chaplain's reading of the Lord's Prayer, launching William into eternity, though not before he was forced to tug on his body in order to ensure that the rope would strangle him on account of the drop having been too short to have broken his neck. The body was left to swing for an hour before it was hauled down, stripped, with Foxton claiming the dead man's trousers and stockings for himself, and the rope taken down and sold off to spectators inch by inch. Following the execution, William's body was swiftly carted off for dissection, as was stipulated by the Murder Act of 1752 that, still in effect in 1828, made it law that all criminals executed for murder could not be buried and had to either be gibbeted or dissected by surgeons for the benefit of science. During the trial, William had become something of a national celebrity, and in death his fame only seemed to grow. Some were sympathetic to his pleas, whilst others saw him as little else than a pantomime villain, just to be jeered. Given the public's enthusiasm for the case, William's first stop was the Shire Hall, where 3 surgeons, George Creed, John Dalton and Charles Smith, cut open his abdomen, whilst over 5,000 members of the public filed past to view the gruesome scene, with several going round multiple times to really get their fill of the gore. When the doors closed to the public that evening, plaster casts were made of William's head in order for the phrenologists to study the shape of his skull and theorise of how his bones had predisposed him to kill. The body's next stop was on to West Suffolk Hospital, where it was once again went under the knife, scrutinised this time by medical students from Cambridge University, who watched him fully anatomised and then experimented upon with a galvanic battery in a scientific bonanza that lasted 3 full days. Finally, the body was entirely dissected, the heart preserved in spirits of wine, sections of the skin tanned, and the skeleton stripped and prepared as an articulated model that was placed in a wooden case at the entrance to the hospital, which is where it stood until 1843, next to William's pistols enclosed in a second case and a fantastically profitable donation box. It was eventually removed from public view after a request from a local clerk, and then in 1949 it was donated to the Royal College of Surgeons, who kept it in the Hunterian Museum for another half-century. In 2004, after a descendant of William Accorder applied for its release, the bones were finally cremated and buried in the churchyard of St Mary's back in the village of Polstead, giving a final bookend to the long and storied life and death of William Corder. On the surface, the case of the Red Barn murder and the subsequent trial of William Corder looked a lot like a cut-and-dry case, supported by circumstantial but ultimately relatively strong evidence. Once the papers were done hanging William, however, news stories began creeping out into the press. For a start, the medical evidence was never particularly conclusive, and perhaps more interestingly, they never did seem to make sense in the light of William's own confession. His confession was given on the night before his execution. The game was up for William, so presumably he had no motive to lie or mislead, and yet right up until the end, he denied ever having stabbed Maria. John Orridge, the prison governor, even claimed to have overheard a conversation between William and another prisoner where he once more denied having ever stabbed Maria. This in a situation where Orridge was sure that he had no idea he was being listened in on. Then, on the 17th of August, the Sunday Times printed an article that stated, during the inquest, when the surgeon took the jury up to the Red Barn to view the body, one of the jurors thrust a knife into the body in order to see how far decay had progressed. This, they said, satisfactorily accounts for the discrepancies. The fact that this event was never detailed by anyone throughout the inquest, nor the trial, nor in the months between, suggests that the story may have had its genesis in rumour, before the Times journalists decided to print it as a fact, a theory that only strengthened as the days went by and no knife-wielding jury member could be uncovered. Muddying the waters further, a letter written by one of the surgeons, John Charles Nairn, in consultation with several of his colleagues, was published that seemed to question the ability of the pistol shot alone to have killed Maria, given its trajectory. Nairn later published a second letter assuring everyone that not a single juryman ever touched the body during the examination of the inquest. One popular theory concerning the stab wounds began to arise, suggesting that they were made with Thomas Martin's mole spike when he was probing the ground whilst looking for his daughter's body. This, however, was quickly debunked, given the fact that the cuts in the throat were uncovered by the green handkerchief and only discovered once it was removed. Furthermore, the body was said to have been lying on its right side, and yet there was stab wounds on the right side of the head, where the spike would not have been able to reach if it was simply probing through the ground. No further comment from the press was made, and with William now hanged and dissected, there was little interest in digging too deeply into the integrity of the inquest, the coroner, or the trial itself, and things were eventually forgotten. So what really happened in the Red Barn? It seems clear that William shot Maria, but if the stab wounds really weren't caused by William, was it murder or manslaughter? Given the circumstances, it may seem like a minor distinction. However, it was a distinction that would have been of major importance to William, whose fate would have hung on that decision. Perhaps the best argument against the charge of murder was given by William himself, who argued why he would have taken her to the barn to kill her if everyone knew that that's where they were going. Further, what motive did he have? There are several theories. First, that he may have murdered their baby, and then later Maria, in order to keep it a secret. But this goes against the facts that the child was known to be sickly after birth by Maria's family. A much better theory is that William was concerned over the theft of the £5 sent to Maria from Matthews for child maintenance. The theft could have carried a death sentence or transportation if it was ever uncovered. And Maria was the only person keeping William out of trouble, as she was the one who had covered it up at the time. Arguments against this theory, however, question why Maria would go back on her cover-up suddenly, especially given the fact that if she did go back on it, she would be perjuring herself in the process. Ultimately, whether or not it was a crime of passion following a heated argument that may or may not have involved a brawl on Maria's part, and if William had not truly intended to kill Maria, it seems likely that a jury would have found William guilty for murder all the same, thanks to the months and months of newspaper articles tearing William's character apart and painting him as a cold-blooded monster. And they may well have been right, especially given the fact that if he did shoot Maria, he shot her in the face after drawing a pistol that he knew was loaded. Perhaps a more interesting element to the case was the prophetic dreams described by Mrs. Anne Martin that had supposedly led to the discovery of the body in the first place. At the time, public opinion was reportedly fairly torn on the matter of their credibility, with some believing her to the full extent, whilst others thought that certain parts were embellished. Others believed that the whole lot was a collection of nonsense. If she was lying, however, why? Her testimony was never questioned during the trial, but if she was lying, it can have pretty disturbing implications when viewed under a certain light. One theory that was first put forward in a book published in 1949 by Dorothy Gibbs and Herbert Maltby suggested that Anne Martin, 20 years her husband's junior and only 9 years older than William himself, had grown tired of her husband and consequently infatuated with William during his frequent visits to the Martin cottage. If the two had wound up in a secret relationship, did Anne feel jealous towards Maria, and had she therefore had a hand in either the murder, or at the very least, in suggesting the murder to William, in order to remove Maria from the situation? If any of this were true, however, there is a stark lack of evidence. And further, why would William have then moved to London and put out advertisements for marriage? Some suggest that while he was in London, William was sending Anne hush money, and when his money ran dry, forcing him to defraud the £93 from the bunk cheque, she invented the dreams in order to incriminate William without causing any suspicion on herself. This all seems fairly implausible, however, and it's backed by absolutely no evidence at all. A second theory, branching off this first, suggests that Anne invented the dreams after William moved to London in order to incriminate him out of spite, which, whilst being perfectly possible, and even somewhat plausible, again lacks any sort of evidence to back it up. Such a theory also fails to question why, if she was involved in the murder in some way, William did not implicate her as such, ensuring that she, too, would have suffered the same fate as himself. In truth, Anne Martin had been especially suspicious of William and of his stories following Maria's disappearance, and even more so after seeing William with Maria's umbrella at his brother's funeral. Had she simply put two and two together, and fearing the worst, taken a guess that William had murdered Maria in the barn? Perhaps her suspicion really did manifest itself in dreams. At the end of the day, it seems most likely that William had murdered Maria by shooting her in the barn, following a heated argument. Nothing more, nothing less. Much of the confusion of the case that later led to conjecture, theories and conspiracies seems to stem from the lack of conclusive medical evidence, along with the lack of integrity in much of the testimony given by the coroner and the surgeons themselves. Whatever happened in the Red Barn, it was finally put to bed in the public's mind on the 26th of December 1842, when the barn itself was burned to the ground, ending over a decade of dark tourism to the site, with some estimating that it had seen over 200,000 visitors since the trial. Still, the memory of Maria Martin lived on, with the story of her murder becoming immortalised in dozens of songs, theatre plays, pamphlets and publications for decades after the affair had officially closed. Even after the story had fallen out of the fashion of the day, it has continued to be retold for centuries, and still remains one of the staples of British crime history, cementing William and Maria's names, albeit for reasons that neither would likely have wished for during their short lives. So that was the story of the Red Barn murder, and we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yeah, the Red Barn murder. I'm glad to have finally got that episode done, because it had been requested quite a lot, like I mentioned, and it is a kind of staple of historical true crime, I guess. It's one of the big sort of British cases, I guess, from the 19th century. But yeah, it's interesting in that. I mean, I can understand why it's such a big case and why it causes so much interest. But actually, I think largely a lot of the stuff that causes that is really just nonsense. I think a lot of the conspiracies and a lot of the sort of theorizing around Anne Martin, for example, and her dreams and stuff like that. I think maybe that's a little bit maybe sort of leaning into the sensationalism of the case a bit too much. I think more or less it took place exactly how it seems to us. And, more or less exactly how William had confessed on the night before his execution. The problem I think it has is the way the entire case was handled, basically, from the moment the coroner found the body. In fact, from the moment the body was discovered, I think the handling of the case was just poor. And I think that's what's led to a lot of stuff. I think with so little evidence and with the medical evidence causing so much controversy at the time, I feel like all of that has opened up avenues for conspiracy and things like that. I think it also gained a lot of sort of interest in the 19th century due to William being reasonably respectable. He owned his father's farm. The family was kind of well off, not rich by any means, but for tenant farmers, that they were quite well off. And William's claim of £400 a year was far too much, but he was making money from his farm, and he did, when he was in London, pass himself off as a respectable gentleman and all that, and everyone thought that he was great. All the character references from him in London are that he was good as gold and a lovely guy and this like very well-to-do gentleman, well respected in the short time that he lived there. And I think that was of interest to people in the 19th century. I think that classism aspect was especially interesting. I think I think people from the poorer classes really enjoyed a story of seeing someone from like the middle and upper classes fall from grace or end up executed. So I think that plays into it a large part as well, and makes this case as sort of big, I guess, as it turned out to be. And because in the 19th century it had like plays and all sorts made about it. I think, largely it owes to that sort of classism going on there. As for the dreams from Anne, I think they're interesting, but I do think they're sort of sensationalised and overhyped. I don't think it's actually that crazy to suspect that she may have had real dreams, but they don't have to be prophetic. It's clear that she had heavy suspicions about William. I don't think she believed him almost from day one when he started coming up with all these terrible stories. Oh, Maria's hurt her hand, so she can't write to you. Oh, we're going to get married, but it's far away. But don't worry, she doesn't need clothes. She's got all that, and she's got all money. I don't think Anne believed that for a second. I think she saw straight through him right from day one. And I think she had heavy suspicions about William from the start. I think that was helped by the fact that her son, George, saw William with a pickaxe going to the barn on the day that he wasn't supposed to be there. And obviously then later she saw him with Maria's umbrella and things like that. And the fact that his story changed from, depending on who he spoke to in the village, his story tended to change little bits at a time. And it was a small village. So the chances are that if he'd have changed his story for someone else, it may well have still got back to Anne. So I think she was suspicious of him right from the start. And I don't think it's that crazy that if she had those suspicions, she may have had a dream, and it doesn't have to be prophetic. It just means that she was, it was on her mind, and causing her some sort of degree of concern, which of course it would do. So I don't think the dreams are that crazy. I suppose it's interesting if you assume they were a lie. And I guess that's where the interest comes from, because really there's three things the dreams could have been, right? They could have been a lie. And then that's interesting. Like, why was she lying? Like, what motive did she have to make up those dreams? And that's where you start going down the conspiracy road, I guess. The other thing is that she had dreams and they were prophetic and she's some sort of witch, and I guess that's quite sensational and exciting. I don't believe it for a second. And then the last option really is that she did have dreams, but they were entirely normal because they were based on natural suspicions that she had. And I think that's probably the most likely outcome. Unfortunately, it's also the most boring because we can't then, go on to have like exciting conspiracy theories, like you can if you suggest that she was lying, which is, what's happened. And now you've got all these theories that maybe she had a hand in the murder and all this. I don't think any of that's true. I don't think she did. I think when you read the ins and outs case, because obviously I've just covered it here, but if you wanted to read into it more, there's an absolute dearth of information. Actually good information. There's a good 2 or 3 excellent books written about this. One, a contemporary pamphlet type book that's quite long and very detailed, and then some other good books as well. They're all in the show notes under the sources. But if you wanted to read into this case, I think everything realistically just points to William shooting her. Whether or not you believe that maybe she shot herself, it's a little bit difficult. The only argument I've seen against that is that the bullet was shot from behind or slightly behind. But I don't think it's that impossible to have shot yourself in that manner. The one bit that I think is worthy of debate is whether or not she died from the bullet and what the wounds were on the rest of her body. And I actually think that the bullet wound is... Well, I think it backs up, actually. I think it backs up the idea that she shot herself, and I think it backs up William's confession. I think either or, because basically the surgeon said that the bullet wouldn't have alone have been enough to have killed her. That's not necessarily true, and I think now we know more about the body. I think the bullet could have caused some sort of tearing of an artery that at the point in time they might have missed. So I do think the bullet was enough to have killed her, but I'm not so sure when you track the trajectory of the bullet that it was a well-placed shot, if you like. And so I think that backs up William's idea that he pulled the gun and shot her whilst she was maybe like scuffling with him. I think that sort of does back up that, like he just sort of shot her in the heat of the moment without sort of really aiming it. But then it also could potentially back up the fact that she shot herself from slightly behind her head and just didn't really have a good sort of angle on herself. So I think it could support both of those theories. I think that the first theory is probably the better one for me. I think he probably did. I think that's exactly what happened. I think his confession was true, basically. And John Orridge, the prison governor, he also said that he thought that was true. That the confession was completely true from what he knew of William and his time in prison. So yeah, but the wounds after the fact, all the cuts and stuff on her, that's quite interesting. But again, that sort of comes back to the start when I was saying, like, due to the like lack of integrity with the medical evidence and the jurors and all going up at the inquest and all things like that, I think that's what leads to conspiracy. I think because we don't have that integrity and we don't know quite how she got those cuts, I think that's where we start going down the conspiracy route. As it happens, I actually believe William. I don't think he did stab her. And I do think he's right when he said that the police found the sword in his room and they basically thought, right, well, we found this sword, the cuts are all his. Like, we'll pin all the cuts on him. I don't think that's true. I think they made a mess of it when they were digging her up, because from the sounds of it, she was quite well decaying at that point. You know, the fact that one of her hands had fallen off her wrist through decay and things like that, she didn't sound in a good state. I think one of the quotes from the surgeons actually said that she had the appearance of being in the ground for a couple of months. So, you know, I don't think she was in a particularly good state. So perhaps, you know, that's quite a delicate body. So perhaps you could cause cuts and tears in the skin and stuff. I don't. It's complicated. The stab in the side is really complicated, and actually the evidence for that is really complex as to if it was a juror and the integrity of the inquest was just a complete mess and that the surgeon allowed someone to stab her in the side to check. But there's also medical evidence to suggest that that's just not possible. And there's also cuts in her clothing that she wasn't wearing, which suggests that that's not possible either. So, you know, those cuts are strange. And I think they're the one mystery about the whole case. I do think they're possibly explained by the sort of lack of integrity in when they dug up the body and when the jury went there. I for the record, I'd say I do believe William. I still think he was obviously guilty. I think perhaps it was like a manslaughter thing or a crime of passion or whatever, rather than premeditated murder. But obviously, you know, he was still guilty. He used the idea that, you know, the panic of it all set in, and he made a load of bad decisions. And that's if you believe him that Maria shot herself. You know, he said, he buried her because the panic set in and he made all these bad decisions. But I think actually he still made a lot of bad decisions, but it was the panic of realisation of what he'd done. I think in the courtroom when he gave his defence, I think if you just substituted Maria shot herself with I shot her, I think the rest of it is probably all true. Yeah, I think he probably did shoot her, but just perhaps at the heat of the moment, an argument, she sort of grabbed him and he pulled the gun and shot. I think that's probably what happened. But yeah, I think that sort of mystery sort of not solved. It's not like I've solved mystery. I just don't think there was that much of a mystery there in the first place. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot more to this case. Like there is some very like strange details about the body and stuff. I say if you wanted to read more into it, all of the big sources are in the show notes. So check them out there. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I think I've taken up way too much of your time now. I've been waffling on for quite a while, so I'll end it there. Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to contact me, you can. Email is contact@darkhistories.com. You can also reach me on all the social media, things like that. All the links for that are in the show notes, as well as a link to the website, which is darkhistories.com. And on there, you can find links to everything. You can, books, merch. If you'd like to support, it shows all the ways that you can do so. And any way that you can support is, greatly received, because, I'm just one person to make this podcast all by myself. It has sort of grown into a much larger thing than I ever expected it to be, which is great, but also, it does require a little bit more. So thank you very much if you do already support. So just putting it out there, if you are able to support and you want to, there are ways, and it's all there. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate having your time, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. So until then, take care, sleep tight.